Hello and welcome to Beaver Hunter Scale Models. In this video I want to show how I painted the Rye Field Sturmgeschütz I built in the last video, with spraying a camouflage freehand, creating paint chips and painting all details and parts like tools, exhaust and additional stuff like leather pads and tarps. So if this sounds interesting to you, please stay tuned. This is the build model as it looked at the end of the last video, where I showed in detail how it was done. You can find the video on my channel, by the way. Before I could start painting it, I obviously had to dismantle it as much as possible and remove loose parts. I planned that in advance while building it and kept as much parts removable as possible, like the tracks and rollers. I then started to glue the smaller parts to toothpicks or cocktail skewers for better handling while painting. The wheels were just put on toothpicks without glue, as the holes were matching perfectly. When every piece was fixed, I made some space on my workbench and got me a big bowl of soapy water. I sprayed some pure alcohol with my airbrush onto all parts to degrease them and then immediately gave them a good wash in the bowl. I here very carefully used a soft brush for mechanical cleaning to get rid of dust, dirt and grease from my fingers. Obviously I had to be very careful with the StuG to not knock off some of the fine PE parts. To speed up the drying process a bit, I used my airbrush to blow away water drops collecting in the crevices and then let it rest until the next day, where it was completely dry. Then came the time for Tamiya's Metal Primer. I applied it by airbrush pure out of the bottle, so I don't have to touch the small PE parts by brush. Applying this primer is really necessary for me, as the paint chips off PE parts pretty easily at the slightest contact, and I don't want to end up with some shiny brass pieces after painting. So I made sure to give every metal piece a good coverage with this stuff. For the primer I this time decided for mahogany brown MrSurfacer diluted with leveling thinner applied by airbrush. In the past I used rattle can primer for my models because I am not the greatest fan of several hour-long airbrush sessions. But this time I wanted full control over the amount of the applied primer. Because although you can achieve very good results with rattle can primer, the model was very angled and built up with parts that were in the way. And I didn't want to flood details because I had to do several passes with the rattle can and end up with too much primer in specific areas. So I applied the primer by airbrush in thin layers with several passes until I was satisfied with the coverage. I really don't like annoying jobs like priming or painting 16 roller pairs, and these plus all the equipment and cargo I added to the vehicle took some time to get primed too. So I was really relieved when the last parts were finally shining in this tasty brown tone. To prime the tracks I again used my helper here, a horizontal attached screw. I pulled the tracks over it while spraying, so the areas in between the track links got exposed and hit by primer too. Like this I can avoid bare resin being visible when attaching the tracks to the model and bending them around the idler or driving wheel. With the priming finally being done, I could apply the first paint, again by airbrush. I chose AK's real color set for the early Panzer colors and started with the dark yellow as a base paint. With that, the next really long airbrush session started, as basically all parts had to be painted in this yellow base paint. I was very thankful that the lacquer based paint sprayed very well and I had no problems with clogging nozzles the whole time. I applied the yellow paint in several thin layers until I was satisfied with the opacity, and I really liked the tone of the color. Again, it was a bit tricky to reach every spot with the airbrush because the vehicle being so angled and with parts in the way. With the base paint applied, I could finally start with spraying the camouflage, and I decided on a pattern from the instructions because I liked the pattern and yellow being the dominant color. I decided to start with the brown spots, and to get a feeling for the thinner paint ratio and the pattern itself, I started with practicing on the side skirts. As I'm not spraying a camouflage every week or month, it took me some time to get back into it and until I found the right ratio, pressure and spraying distance. But it worked better and better the more time I spent on the model, and my confidence rose more and more. Spraying the vehicle itself was a bit more tricky as the instructions only showed the sides, partly covered by the side skirts and no view from above. So I sprayed what I could see in the instructions and then tried to connect the spots freestyle in a way that makes sense and also looks good. It's important that a camouflage not only adds color to the vehicle, but also goes over the edges and around corners, because this blends the vehicle in the surroundings too, by making hard, straight edges round and soft. With the brown spots done, I next applied the green spots. I again started on the skirts to see how the two colors harmonize and if the pattern works. And I was really satisfied with what I saw. The colors looked good to me and the pattern was coming along like I saw it in the instructions. With my confidence at its peak, I then switched to the vehicle and added the green spots here too, working it into the vehicle's shape and making the picture look more complete. I did not apply the brown and green spots with full coverage, but in a slightly cloudy pattern, so it's not looking too perfect, but slightly worn out by weather, sun and operating time. And this adds to the, for me, preferred look of a field applied camouflage over maybe perfectly sharp factory applied ones. Like I said earlier, I'm not the greatest fan of airbrushing for hours and hours, so I split the whole airbrush process over several days, taking the time I need for a good result and giving my hands and mind enough breaks to rest and recover. And after several days I got to this point with the basic camouflage airbrushed, and I was really happy how it was looking. I guess I never cleaned my airbrushes that often in such a short amount of time. But I wasn't done yet, as I wanted to refine the camouflage a bit more. And to do that, I grabbed me a lighter yellowish tone and lightened up the basic paints a bit to spray a lighter version into the respective areas. I started with the yellow areas and sprayed the lightened up dark yellow unregular on top of it, using it to break up the bigger surfaces, making them look more worn out and highlight raised areas and spots on the vehicle. This was also a good moment to rework areas where I maybe didn't spray the green and brown spots perfectly and deal with overspray if necessary. I repeated this step with the green spots by applying lightened up green into the spots unregular and on raised areas like these engine covers, and finished the camouflage by spraying the lightened up brown paint into the brown spots. Now I could really call the camouflage done and finally put the airbrush aside for now. I was still very pleased with the result and in full camouflage spraying mode. Too bad I can't make a save point here and retrieve the learned stuff when spraying the next camouflage whenever the time comes. AK has the matching markers to these camouflage tones and I wanted to give them a try here. I use them to define specific areas as the markers are slightly brighter than the sprayed paint, so I could highlight parts that stood out or made small corrections to the spot's shape and tricky areas like hinges on suspension covers. And this is a good and quick way to repaint things like tool clamps that got hit by too much overspray. I repeated the step with a green marker, highlighting raised parts, reworking areas like hinges, tool clamps and so on. The brown marker from the set wasn't matching because it's a red brown one and I used the dark brown here. Obviously this step is optional or could be done by brush too. With the paint job done, I grabbed me the decals and some matte varnish. I poured the varnish straight from the bottle and applied it in several layers over the parts where the decals will be applied, until I got a good coverage. I am really glad to be an armored modeler because I don't really like applying them, and here I only needed to apply 2 for the whole model, what was great to me. After the decals came off the backing paper in the water, I placed them on the skirts and removed the water with a Q-tip. Then I applied some decal softener and before letting it sit for a few minutes, I pushed it in the right position carefully with a toothpick. When the softener had some time to work on the decals, I removed the excess with a Q-tip again and let it dry out for a few minutes more. Next I applied a good amount of decal fixer and let it air dry untouched. This stuff can be aggressive to the paint even with the matte varnish applied, so be careful and maybe test it on an area that later won't be that visible. And after some thin sealing layers of matte varnish again, I was rewarded with some nice, not shining markings on the side skirts. Next chapter, chipping. I decided on a 2-color chipping using a dark tone for the yellow and green areas and a lighter tone for the brown and greens. Ammo's chipping color was my choice for the dark chips and I started by applying this by sponge very gentle and carefully after unloading the sponge on a paper towel before touching the model. In the past I chipped the life out of my models as I liked used and worn out looks. So I added a lot of chips, rusting them with enamels or oils almost to death, making the model look like being in combat for 20 years. I liked it back then, but in the meantime I realized that the models I liked from other guys had very subtle if any chipping at all. So for this model I really had the intention to not overdo the chipping, just adding some few random chips and chips to areas with a lot of traffic or moving parts like the side skirt holders or around hedges, and to obvious areas like edges. To have more control over the application and for hard to reach areas, I grabbed me a super fine brush with a pointy tip and with that worked on edges or places like hedges to add more controlled and better placed chips. It's always a bit difficult to make it look random like this, but after some practice I think it worked out fine. For the dark brown and green spots I mixed me a lighter chipping color from Ammo's matching dark yellow and a drop of deck tan to lighten it up. And with that again started with sponge application carefully and dosed into the darker areas and edges after unloading the sponge on a paper towel. My intention to create a maybe more realistic aged vehicle is also the reason why I did not add tons of battle and grenade damage like I did it on my Panther, and basically added just some moderate damage to one skirt holder and the back fenders. I then again grabbed me a brush and reworked the edges and hard to reach areas, connecting smaller random chips or applying them in a more controlled way. Some of the light chips came out a bit too big and I here added a small amount of dark chipping color into the center, so in just a few cases I also ended up with a two-tone chipping. And this is the result of my chipping session. I think I really did better here compared to my Panther, with a better dosed amount and size of the chips, not being too dominant but just adding some interest to the vehicle. And another benefit of being thrifty with the application is I was way quicker with chipping than I expected. On the rollers I went a bit more messy and heavy, just slapping some random chips by sponge here and there. The reason is that most of it will be covered anyway by mud and earth later, so only a few of them will be visible after weathering. And like this, there won't be any blank areas on the parts which should show more wear and tear because of contact to ground and tracks. To finish painting the rollers, I grabbed me the matching marker set by AK and started to paint the rubber parts with rubber black. This was so quick and easy, it somehow felt like cheating. From the feedback I received on Instagram to the markers, I realized that these seem to split the modeling community. Some saying it's unnecessary and a waste of money, some like them. As far as I see it, they are a welcome time saver for annoying jobs like painting 16 roller pairs. I could do it by brush, I did it before, but why should I spend 2 hours painting them by brush when I could do it in 20 minutes with the markers? As a father and shift worker, doing scale modeling in my rare free time, saving some time here and there is always welcome. And it's not like I would paint a figure's face or the whole vehicle with them, but I think they are perfect for time-consuming or not so interesting jobs like these. So after the rubber parts, I painted the bare metal parts on the idler and driving rollers with the matching marker. And was soon done with painting all the rollers in an appropriate amount of time and could move on to the next task, the detail painting. I started with base painting all metal parts of the tools with a black base paint. I want to try to improve my approach of non-metallic paints for metal parts, and I here want to create tools that don't look like they are rusting on an abandoned vehicle for decades, but like they actually get used from time to time. And this is supposed to add to the overall impression of the vehicle being aged a bit more moderate. Because I was a bit nervous about dealing with black paint over the painted model, I placed some pieces of paper underneath the tools. Usually I like challenges like these, but here I thought better safe than sorry. Next I made a wash over all black parts with a slightly darker grey tone. I then used a medium grey paint and started to paint areas which were raised or that would maybe hit by light and therefore reflecting some. Also, contact areas on the tools were painted like this to make them look blank from steady use. I then added some white to the grey paint, slowly lightened it up more and more with every pass I made on the tools. The lighter the paint became, the smaller became the painted areas, and like this I built up the effect of blank and maybe reflecting tools. Needless to say that good brushes are helpful here, and these Abteilung brushes were perfect for this job with their pointy tip. To finish the effect I used pure white and with that just slightly touched the most raised or exposed parts with the brush, tapping the highest highlight into place. To add to the metallic look I finished the parts with a very thin light blue wash. I tried to be very careful here to not overdo it or using too thick paint, as this could easily end up looking like a blank sword or being frozen. But I think it adds a lot to the final look. And that's the result of my non-metallic try. Although not perfect of course, I like the result and I will invest more time in the future to get better with this. Right now I am not sure how I will finish them in the weathering stage, but I am sure that this will come when the time is right. Next I painted the wooden parts, and after base painting them with the dark brown paint, I made a wash with an orangish tone over them, again very diluted. With a light beige paint and a fine brush I then started to paint some wood grain onto the parts, trying to paint thin stripes not covering the base completely. With the second light paint I then repeated this step, trying to bring some more variation into the grain by placing these painted stripes in between the previously painted ones, or on top of 2 big stripes from the first round. With pure black I tried to break the bright grain and add some dark elements and texture to it. I applied this very carefully to not end up with a too dark grain, just adding some details here and there. To unify and blend the grain in, I used different brown tones and applied them on top of each other as very thin washes after the previous one had some time to dry. Like this I could bring the wood parts into different wooden tones and vary the look slightly. And the grain got toned down a bit, making it more subtle. And this is my wood result. Not perfect again, but good enough to be hidden under some branches for camouflage on the finished model later. Next step, exhaust. To paint the exhaust in preparation for later enamel and oil weathering, I started with a light base paint. This paint is actually a very bright skin tone, almost white with a slight touch of red, and because of that a good foundation. Next step was a wash with a greyish blue mix to bring the part more into a metallic-like direction, adding the impression of old metal sheet. I then started to add a dark brown rusty color on top of that, first by sponge for an irregular pattern. I therefore placed some pieces of paper again so I didn't hit the vehicle's back by accident. And second, with a brush I painted the areas I couldn't reach with a sponge and defined the effect so it's more rusted on the top where more heat would be and less on the lower area. I connected the sponge chips with the brush by applying the paint with a stippling motion so it looks more chipped off instead of just painted. And that's the acrylic painted exhaust ready for some weathering where I will add rust tones with enamels and oil paints to give it a burnt out look. The hedge of the commander's cupola had this leather pad which I wanted to paint in a slightly worn out look. I therefore base painted it in a dark brown tone and then applied a slightly lighter tone diluted with retarder into this with a stippling motion. When this was dry, I added some orange brown to the lighter brown, slowly making it brighter, and started to paint some Hier and Hier into the leather. Again, like on the tool's metal parts, I added more and more orange brown to the mix and painted smaller areas with each pass. This gave the leather a used and slightly worn out look. And as a finishing step I made a wash with a light brown to integrate the Hier and Hier into the surface and make it less dominant. And I was pretty happy with the result. The tarps were the last things to get painted and I again started with the base painting being applied over a dark brown foundation. Very diluted again so the dark base coat can shine through. This is again the first layer followed by several lighter ones and I didn't paint the darkest spots or deepest folds here to create some kind of depth and gives the impression of shadows. Before I started to add the highlights, I marked the positions where the crew member will sit because this area should be darker as it's not hit by light. Then I could start to add some yellow paint to the base paint to lighten it up in several steps and made again several passes with the diluted paint to paint the highlights with the painted areas becoming smaller the lighter the paint became. I here again tried to not overdo it with the contrast from dark to light as I wanted the tarp to not stick out from the overall look of the vehicle by being too heavy contrasted. When I was satisfied with the highlights, I made a wash with the base paint over the whole piece to unify the surface and blend the transitions. I also collected the pooling paint in the deeper spots and crevices so it's not covering the shadowed areas. And that's the painted tarp with the crew member sitting in the darker area with the highlights being next to him. The cover of the muzzle brake and the gun cleaning rod were painted in the same way with the same paints, so they integrate into the vehicle and don't stick out too much. After quickly applying the decal to the fire extinguisher over some matte varnish, I sealed the whole model and all the parts with a good saturated layer of Bergswerk matte varnish for the later enamel and oil weathering. In the past I used satin varnish for that, for better blending of oils and enamels, but I again learned from other modelers it would improve the contrast of the model if I use matte varnish here. I hope that pays off and doesn't end in a mess later. And yeah, that's it for now. The basic paint job is done with spraying the camouflage, chipping and painting all details. I am super happy with the result after I had to fight into spraying a camouflage again after some time. But I think the effort of countless hours with my airbrush really paid off. The next video will be about weathering this build, making a pin wash, adding rust tones, earth, mud, dirt and grime. So if I maybe caught your interest and you are curious how this will be looking when done, please stay tuned. And I would be super happy if you support me by subscribing. I am looking forward to your feedback and constructive criticism. Let me know how you like it so far. If you are still here, thank you very much for watching, I really appreciate that. But enough talking from me, stay safe and until the next time.